for some time. Then came her younger sister, and later the brother who attended a school close by. He informed Muishkin that his father had lately found a new interpretation of the star called wormwood which fell upon the water springs, as described in the Apocalypse. He had decided that it meant the network of railroads spread over the face of Europe at the present time. The prince refused to believe that Lebedeff could have given such an interpretation, and they decided to ask him about it at the earliest opportunity. Vera related how Keller had taken up his abode with them on the previous evening. She thought he would remain for some time, as he was greatly pleased with the society of General Ivolgin and of the whole family. But he declared that he had only come to them in order to complete his education. The prince always enjoyed the company of Lebedeff's children, and today it was especially welcome, for Colia did not appear all day. Early that morning he had started for Petersburg. Lebedeff also was away on business, but Gavrila Ardalionovitch had promised to visit Muishkin, who eagerly awaited his coming. About 7 in the evening, soon after dinner, he arrived. At the first glance, it struck the prince that he, at any rate, must know all the details of last night's affair. Indeed, it would have been impossible for him to remain in ignorance, considering the intimate relationship between him, Varvara Ardalionovna, and Ptitsin. But although he and the prince were intimate in a sense, and although the latter had placed the Burdovsky affair in his hands, and this was not the only mark of confidence he had received, it seemed curious how many matters there were that were tacitly avoided in their conversations. Muishkin thought that Gania at times appeared to desire more cordiality and frankness. It was apparent now, when he entered, that he was convinced that the moment for breaking the ice between them had come at last. But all the same, Gania was in haste, for his sister was waiting at Lebedeff's to consult him on an urgent matter of business. If he had anticipated impatient questions or impulsive confidences, he was soon undeceived. The prince was thoughtful, reserved, even a little absent-minded, and asked none of the questions, one in particular, that Gania had expected. So he imitated the prince's demeanour, and talked fast and brilliantly upon all subjects but the one on which their thoughts were engaged. Among other things, Gania told his host that Nastasia Philipovna had been only 4 days in Pavlovsk, and that everyone was talking about her already. She was staying with Daria Alexeyevna in an ugly little house in Matrosky Street, but drove about in the smartest carriage in the place. A crowd of followers had pursued her from the first, young and old. Some escorted her on horseback when she took the air in her carriage. She was as capricious as ever in the choice of her acquaintances, and admitted few into her narrow circle. Yet she already had a numerous following, and many champions on whom she could depend in time of need. One gentleman on his holiday had broken off his engagement on her account, and an old general had quarrelled with his only son for the same reason. She was accompanied sometimes in her carriage by a girl of 16, a distant relative of her hostess. This young lady sang very well. In fact, her music had given a kind of notoriety to their little house. Nastasia, however, was behaving with great discretion on the whole. She dressed quietly, though with such taste as to drive all the ladies in Pavlovsk mad with envy. of that as well as of her beauty and her carriage and horses. "As for yesterday's episode," continued Gania, "of course it was prearranged." Here he paused, as though expecting to be asked how he knew that. But the prince did not inquire. Concerning Evgenie Pavlovitch, Gania stated, without being asked, that he believed the former had not known Nastasia Philipovna in past years, but that he had probably been introduced to her by somebody in the park during these 4 days. As to the question of the IOUs she had spoken of, there might easily be something in that; for though Evgenie was undoubtedly a man of wealth, yet certain of his affairs were equally undoubtedly in disorder. Arrived at this interesting point, Gania suddenly broke off, and said no more about Nastasia's prank of the previous evening. At last Varvara Ardalionovna came in search of her brother, and remained for a few minutes. Without Muishkin's asking her, she informed him that Evgenie Pavlovitch was spending the day in Petersburg, and perhaps would remain there over tomorrow, and that her husband had also gone to town, probably in connection with Evgenie Pavlovitch's affairs. "Lizabetha Prokofievna is in a really fiendish temper today," she added as she went out. "But the most curious thing is that Aglaya has quarrelled with her whole family. Not only with her father and mother, but with her sisters also. It is not a good sign." She said all this quite casually, though it was extremely important in the eyes of the prince, and went off with her brother. Regarding the episode of Pavlicheff's son, Gania had been absolutely silent, partly from a kind of false modesty, partly perhaps to spare the prince's feelings. The latter, however, thanked him again for the trouble he had taken in the affair. Muishkin was glad enough to be left alone. He went out of the garden, crossed the road and entered the park. He wished to reflect, and to make up his mind as to a certain step. This step was one of those things, however, which are not thought out, as a rule, but decided for or against hastily and without much reflection. The fact is, he felt a longing to leave all this and go away, go anywhere, if only it were far enough, and at once, without bidding farewell to anyone. He felt a presentiment that if he remained but a few days more in this place, and among these people, he would be fixed there irrevocably and permanently. However, in a very few minutes he decided that to run away was impossible, that it would be cowardly, that great problems lay before him, and that he had no right to leave them unsolved, or at least to refuse to give all his energy and strength to the attempt to solve them. Having come to this determination, he turned and went home, his walk having lasted less than a quarter of an hour. At that moment he was thoroughly unhappy. Lebedeff had not returned, so towards evening Keller managed to penetrate into the prince's apartments. He was not drunk, but in a confidential and talkative mood. He announced that he had come to tell the story of his life to Muishkin, and had only remained at Pavlovsk for that purpose. There was no means of turning him out. Nothing short of an earthquake would have removed him. In the manner of one with long hours before him, he began his history. But after a few incoherent words, he jumped to the conclusion, which was that, having ceased to believe in God Almighty, he had lost every vestige of morality, and had gone so far as to commit a theft. "Could you imagine such a thing?" said he. "Listen to me, Keller," returned the prince. "If I were in your place, I should not acknowledge that unless it were absolutely necessary.